All right, so today we are going to talk about how to make bottles and vases. So basically the technique is to throw a tall cylinder, right, whoop, and then form it out into a shape. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start with a 5-pound ball of clay and throw. If you look in my videos, you can, other videos, right, that you guys, that we have access to, that there's another video where I center more clay, and that's a slightly different technique, mostly the same, but there's some issues when centering like a 10-pound ball of clay that we're not going to cover. But for, I think for most of us, 5 pounds of clay is good enough, and you'll see that I'm able to make a pretty good size cylinder. The most important part is one, well, let's just go through the list. There's actually way more than one most important part. There's like a bunch of things. One is make sure that you are in good shape, like physically, mentally, because you're trying to, through this process, right, you want to make the tallest, best cylinder that you can. Right, and that means more clay, you're pushing yourself a little bit. It's difficult to do if you're tired or worn out because it's physically engaging, right? It's like throwing is a very physical activity, and right, it's you're mentally, you have to be really focused, right? Because you're hopefully trying to do something better with more clay than you've done before. Because that's part of the deal, right? We're always trying to get lighter, more efficient, because if we start with our 5-pound ball of clay and we throw a very thick, clunky cylinder, we end up with a short one, right? But as you get better and you can throw more efficiently, the 5-pound ball of clay magically gets big, and it's really great, and you feel good. As you get better, you can then add more clay to it, right? A 10-pound ball of clay or a 25-pound blob of clay. That's a pretty awesome experience when you can basically wedge a whole bag and throw it all at once. And for us, since it comes in 25-pound bags, that's kind of a milestone, right? Half a bag is a milestone, right? Because I could do 5 blobs, but it doesn't feel like you really like. But when you can throw half a bag down or a whole bag down, that's an experience, right? And you kind of reach, like you're kind of there, and you can know that you can pull it off, right? And make something, okay. How do you get there? Well, the first bag of clay, the 25-pound ball or the 10-pound ball of clay isn't really going to work out great. I just got to tell you, it's just like when you throw anything else, the first time you do it, you're just not going to be great at it. Sorry. But the only way you get better at making taller cylinders to make a vase or a bottle is just to do it. And just like anything, there's a failure rate, and then it's about self-improvement over time. You are becoming a better, every pot that fails, that you don't do great on, is making you a better person. Right, that's part of the journey. We're not here because we just want to get a paycheck or something. It's all for self-improvement, betterment, self-expression, lots of those things. So struggle through it, and the only way I learned how to do it was I spent basically a term, and all I was going to make is vases and bottles, and I just spent a term learning how to throw cylinders, and that's the key. Right? If I give you this cylinder, I throw a good cylinder, right, that's has even wall thickness and it has nice, but lots of different qualities we'll talk about, you could make a good vase out of it or a good bottle out of it, right? The key is making a cylinder that's thing. So let's talk about that. So clay, when you start with clay, the clay needs to be in good shape. So we talked about yourself as a person. You need to be in good shape, meaning like don't like just had an argument with your family and things like that. It's very difficult because psychologically, physically, you don't want to do like the biggest like weight room workout and then be all sore and try to come in and do this, because you need to physically engage this clay. You need to be safe. Number 2 is you want your clay to be the best shape possible as well. So I am using new clay out of the bag. Now, it's not that reclaimed clay or clay that you've wedged up isn't as good. Well, it isn't, right? First of all, but I am also, the clay that I'm using fresh out of the bag is the clay that I'm most used to throwing. Right? It's the most consistent. And for me, when I throw, reclaimed clay is always a little bit different, right? It could be a little wetter or a little drier. It could have hard spots in it. There's lots of little issues, right, that can make this more difficult for me. And since I'm trying to get the most out of this, giving yourself, being set up for success is critical. So giving yourself the best opportunity to be successful, right? If I throw this and it doesn't work and I have to wedge it out, I'm not going to try to throw another vase out of this. I'll use it to make cups and bowls and regular things that I can do very much a little bit easier. I save this clay always is like vase clay things and bottles. All right, so I've wedged it up really good, and you can already see I kind of formed it up into something like that. You could do a ball, you can do whatever, right? And so I'm going to put it in the middle. You can also see that I'm throwing, for such a 5-pound ball of clay, I'm actually throwing on a small bat, right? Let's just slap it down and I'll talk. Okay, so I could already see I did it off center. You see that? That's not good. We're just gonna peel that baby off and get it into the middle. So sometimes when you do that slap down mode, it's way off center, right? When you do it, sometimes it's most easier just to place it in the middle, just eyeball it like that, and then you can slap it down a few times. That's stuck, right? Whatever you need to do. But when you're doing a slightly bigger piece of clay, there's a lot of effort, right, that has to go into centering when it's that far off center, especially with a 5-pound ball of clay or a 10-pound ball of clay. You can even cut it off and get it more into the middle. And then we do this thing where we kind of slap it on center, because the minute I add water, the clay is getting softer, right? And it's hard work centering, like, oh, it's a lot of effort. So what I do here is I'll slap it into center too. Like, you see how it's like touching there, touching my hand, touching here. You see how it's touching. So this part here is sticking out more that way, right? You guys see that? It's going that way. So I'll just take some time and slap that inward, right? And then since it's getting close, I'll cup both my hands like this and do this togetherness, right? Because I would love it if it was more centered. Can we switch stools for a second? Because this stool is a little high for this. And I'll lower it down. You can have it back in a second. Oh, goodness. And I hit my thing. That was not so good. Let me recenter that. All right, so now we're mostly ready to go. So the stool I had was too high. And for centering a slightly bigger piece of clay, I want to be like closer to it. I felt really high up. I want to be a little closer, but later on, okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. I'll want to change my height. So here we're wetting it down. A bigger piece of clay, you have to go slower on your wheel. The general rule of thumb is smaller piece of clay like cups and things or throwing spouts, you can almost floor it. Well, not for cups, but for little itty bitty bits of clay, you can go really fast. As the clay gets bigger, you have to slow down because that mass starts like tossing you around, and instead of you throwing the clay is throwing you around, right? So wet this down, and I have a nice slow wheel speed, and I have to bear down on this, right? Go up like that. I'm squeezing, and I'm going up, and I'm centering, right? And I go up. And so if part of learning how to throw a bigger cylinder is starting with a slightly larger piece of clay, things to note: slower wheel speed, and lots of clay is going to come off on your hands, right? It's just the way it goes. Now, not that much will come off on my hands, but as a person that may be going to a slightly larger piece of clay, you'll notice that. Slower wheel speed, and I have to like do the centering motion. Takes longer for me to get up and down, right? So it does take some more strength, right? And don't hold your breath, right? Because a lot of times you may not notice this, but some of you may be holding your breath as you do raises and throwing and centering, right? And for a little piece of clay, you're able to get up and like that, and you might suffocate yourself. I mean, you'll stop, but just breathe, right? There we go. And then you see it's almost centered, right? So it's not going to go this easy. So why is this going so easily for me, right? You see, I basically got it centered, and what was that, 3 or 4 raises, and it didn't look like I was struggling, but compared to a smaller piece of clay, I was engaging it pretty aggressively for me. How could I make that look that easy? Well, one is if I really needed to, I could throw down a 25-pound ball of clay and center it. So my comfort zone is much bigger than yours as students, right? So then when I go back down to this size, this feels like nothing. Although I do feel it a little bit in my arms because I was bearing down. Part of it is why maybe you're not even interested in doing this. As you get a bigger piece of clay, right? If you can struggle, this might be a struggle to center this. When you go back to cups, the smaller piece of clay, or regular sized bowls, those pieces of clay, if you learn how to do this, those pieces of clay will be much easier to center. So it's just that my range for what I'm comfortable with is bigger, broader, right? And I know how to use my leverage and my core muscles. That makes sense. So that's how I'm able to make that look pretty easy. All right, so now we got this. Now I have to start thinking it's centered, but I have to start getting it ready to do its thing, right? To opening and stuff. I have to think about how wide do I want this blob here, right? How wide do I want this? The edge, the width of this will determine the width of my cylinder. If I leave this is pretty wide for what I'm thinking about. This is too wide, because if I just go like this, I'm going to end up with a wide cylinder, and the wider the cylinder is, the shorter it will be, because the circumference, right, around how much clay it takes to go around is more. So I want to shrink this down, right? So what do? It's just like centering. I'm just going to squish in from the sides, right? If I was thinking about this beforehand, I could have controlled it earlier, right? But I forgot. So I'm just going to squish in from the sides like, oh, like that, right? And if I do a good job, it gets narrower without getting knocked off center, right? If it was centered already. If it gets knocked off center, I will then continue like this and start centering again, right? That makes sense? So, but like I said, I want to set myself up for success. The clay is really good. I'm trying to be physically and mentally in good shape before I start this, right? So it feels pretty centered, right? It's feeling pretty good. So now what I'm going to do is push it down, but I'm going to try to leave it wide. I'm going to try to leave it wide. So go down now. Right? I'm not trying to push on the bottom to make it wide. So now if you look at this blob, this is pretty tall for the width, what we would normally do. But I want it to go high, so by leaving this not so wide, it allows me to make a narrower cylinder. There's a point of where narrower gets more difficult, right? One, I have to be able to get my hand inside the cylinder, right? When I'm throwing, you just can't make a cylinder like that big around and make it 5 feet tall. Right? It's just then it has no strength. So there's a limit, and you have to experiment around, right, with how wide it is. But if we look at the comparison between the width of my hand and the width of the cylinder, I feel comfortable with that. How do I know that? By messing around and doing it a lot, right? So I'm feeling okay with that. But what that means is that whatever the base is, once I throw it, isn't going to be wider than this. Right? And I'll probably trim it a little bit. That base is actually going to be narrower. So if you want something that has a narrower, like a big, like nice big, like balloon shape, right? And it has a big undercut, right? And it looks like it has a narrow base. It's better to start with a kind of a narrow thing. If you want a pot that's nice and grounded looking and has a wide base, right? Then you can start wider. All right, here we go. So now we're going to open, right? And I do the same thing that I would normally do with opening, right? Let's bring this closer. Woohoo! Might as well, since we can, right? And I'll push here like that, right? And I'll just do my normal opening. Go down, 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 down. Now, you will get to a point where it doesn't, you're kind of going past where you're normally comfortable, right? Because this is like, not that much clay. I've gone down about that much, right? That's like a normal size clay. That's like half the amount of clay that I've gone down. We can try to figure this out, meaning like it's getting a little tight in there, right? And I'm getting a little bit beyond where I normally would. So I have a little trick. I can open this up, create a false bottom. You see that, how I just opened it up as if I was going to leave the base thick? That gives me more room to go back down and go down again. Does that make sense? Because this is way too thick right now from here to the bottom. So now what I'm going to do is go back down again by just pushing down. And that just gives my hand more space. Now for this piece of clay, I would have been comfortable just diving all the way to the bottom, but because maybe you guys might want to break it up into steps, we could do it that way. Now every step is critical, especially this next part where I'm going to check the thickness, because I don't want to put all the work that I'm about to do if I've already made it too thin, right? Because the thinness promotes cracking, right, if you mess it up. So I stopped, hopefully too higher, thicker than what I want, right? So I'll check. Oh, that's way thicker than what I want. I can remove about 1/3 of that distance, maybe 1/4, and I'll still be okay. So I'll just go down a little bit more. Let's open it up just a tad. And so, right, I'll go down and check it again. Right there, we'll check. Stab, check. Oh, that's pretty good. Right, and so what does that distance allow me? It allows me to trim a foot, so we'll trim a foot on there next time. If you're not going to trim a foot, like your vase maybe doesn't need a foot or whatever, you just have a flat bottom, that's fine. I could go a little bit thinner because I don't need to leave that extra thickness to trim the bottom. But part of this funness for showing you is trimming a vase. So now, the one thing I have to talk about here that's a little bit different is, I guess we should have left it, is that this vertical distance here going down, this hole is deeper, right? So normally when I'm doing a bowl or a cup, when I'm pulling back, I'm pretty short. But here, since I have to reach all the way to the bottom, my hand is more extended when I'm doing the pull to make it wider. So you got to compensate there. I will also, because this is so long, right, when I'm pulling back, I will lay my other hand on top and they'll pull together, right? Which I do a lot. But when I'm pulling like this with a shorter piece of clay, it's much tighter, it's much stronger, where if I have to extend this hand out more like that to reach the bottom here, right, I need extra support. So here we go. Pull straight back. All right, I'm watching the bottom, making sure it's flat. These are all things that we should always be doing anyways, right? This bat is wobbling around, so that makes me a little nervous. I should have checked the bat. So some of these bats, right, are a little bit looser than others, right? And so they don't fit on the bat pins as well. So I'm going to slowly release. Then, okay, so that feels like a good, like I pulled it out a good amount. We're going to go out here. And then right now is the time I want to clean up this inside right now, right? Because once I make this a tall cylinder, it's going to be hard to see what's going on down there. So here I just clean it up by smashing it flat, making it look beautiful like that. Oh, that looks beautiful, really nice. And then I'm also kind of compressing, but you see I'm just making the inside look better. All right, so now is the critical parts. We start some of the critical parts. If you look here, it's flaring outward just a little bit, right? Here is a little bit narrower than here. This is out a little bit. I would love it if it's flaring inward, so I'm going to push this in like that. Push that in a little bit. I'll do it again, push in a little bit. So that will actually make it just a little bit taller. So starting now, I'm going to start raising, okay? And I get, in general, when you're raising, you get 3 really good raises out of it. You could do some corrections like I was doing, and people wonder why. Why can't you do 4 really good raises? Well, it's just the way it is, and through the raising process, the clay gets really stressed out. So it's kind of funny, whether people talk about it or not, right? If you're watching YouTube or other people throw, they get 3 really good chances to squeeze that clay and make that cylinder taller, right? There's crazy little bit weird things you can do to give yourself another shot at it. You can dry the cylinder out or whatever. It is not just about thinness. It is not just about that it's starting to collapse, that the clay is getting wet. It's also clay is getting stressed out, right? And so as you're raising, the clay, right, wants to fold down on itself, right? We've seen that. It's just 3 is the magic number. So you have to, this thicker piece of clay, be kind of aggressive for the first pull, because the clay is the thickest, right? And I can really into it, and it's not going to collapse. Like this is not going to collapse, right? That's like an inch thick. I prep the clay by squeezing it, getting it into the shape I want. I want to wet it down inside and outside, right? And so from the inside, I'm going to push like this. I'm going to push out straight along the bottom down here, like straight out. This hand, everyone take their hand and kind of point their finger outward, their index finger, their right hand. And then what I do is I fold it over, but you see how I leave that finger sticking out like that? You guys see that? The finger is pointing, sticking out. Right? That knuckle is protruding past the other fingers, right? And then I will bear down on that with my thumb. You see that? So bend over, bear down with it. So this thumb is actually pushing down against that finger, and that makes a hard blob, and I'm clenching it a little bit, okay? And so you'll see that this now becomes kind of stiff and hard, right? Why do we want to do this? Why? Because when I do it this way with my fingers, like when we're doing cups and stuff and bowls, we're just squeezing like this with our fingers, and we're able to get a rise, everything moves. This clay is thicker, right? It's harder to move, and we want to be able to deliver a good amount of force into it the first time, because we only got 3 shots at this. If I try to do it with my fingers, the fingers are weaker, and they can't really drive into the clay a lot of times the way we need it to go. So the trick is pointy finger like that, wrap it over, and then push your thumb down. Why? Why is that better? Is because it's a little bit closer, right? It makes the lever a little shorter, and so I'm able to push harder into it. When I'm doing big amounts of clay, like big ones, this isn't strong enough to push hard into the clay like a 25-pounder. So I actually use this part of my hand, and that's the way I push. I use this thing right here. I don't know what we call that. It's a bone or something, and I push in from there, and I push out from the inside. And that's the way I do my first raise there, because that is even stronger. The sacrifice is when I'm doing that, I don't have any touch or feel, right? I'm just driving, and I have no modulation. I don't really have a good feeling if the clay's about to collapse or anything like that. Here, a little bit the same way, like I can push it, I can drive into the clay, push hard, but I don't know like how the clay is necessarily responding. I'm not sensitive. So you'll notice that for this one, I'll push this way, and then later I'll switch to this because I get a better feeling for the clay and how much force I'm applying. All right, so I wet the whole thing down, I'll push here from this side, push in out from the outside. I will connect them together, right? The outside knuckle will be lower, right? You see how it's lower, and I'll be pushing here. This one feels like it's pushing up, like pushing up a little bit. You see how it's turning and it's going up a little bit into the clay. This hand, inside hand, just like always, will be a little bit taller. It's just kind of pushing straight out. Remember that we want to keep this in a cylinder, not a bowl. So for me, it feels like I need to drive harder from the outside, or else it starts to flare out and become something like that. And if it starts flaring outward, it's more work for me to fix, right? So here, and I connect them together. So you see how they're linked together like one tool? I push, 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 and I start going up. And then the goal is to make it so there's a problem here because the bat is wobbling, right? The goal especially on the first raise, is to make the cylinder even. So if we look at the top down, you'll see that cylinder is even. So what happens sometimes is the cylinder is thicker at the bottom, right? That happens sometimes with us. If it's thicker at the bottom here, I would push harder at the bottom, especially from the inside. I would squeeze it harder to get that bottom thinned out more. And then as I raise up, I'll let up the pressure, because once I get it even, everything starts falling into place. So even cylinder. Now, I can already tell that I should have been more aggressive. Like I would want more height out of that first raise. Just from experience. I will take some time to do some maintenance. So if the cylinder isn't straight up and down, I would fix that right now, but it is, just by squeezing certain parts in. This side is doing something weird, right? The top isn't even, so I'll wet that down and round that off, right, to make it nice and rounded. Right, so this time I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive because I wasn't thinking that. I'll just be a little bit more aggressive. Same hand position again.
Is it even, or is this up higher?
It's always this outside hand is lower, right? Just like when we're using our fingers, outside hand is lower. This is lower, right? This one feels like to me like it's pushing up and in, right? Driving up and into the clay a little bit. This one's pushing straight out more. Here we go. If this ever gets uneven down here, like sometimes you have an unevenness, just cut it off like this. Even though I don't need to do it, I'll do it. See that? Just like how we undercut the clay. So I'm just showing you as a thing. And then that creates a dry piece of clay there, not wet. not whatever, dry, I'll wet that whole area down, and then I'll do the raise again. So I'm connecting again, and I'm going to be more aggressive because I want this to be much taller. So I'm hoping I could at least like double it. So I'm hoping it'll be like up in here somewhere. Let's back that away now, since yeah, so we can see the whole process. There we go. So I'm going to be more aggressive because I wasn't aggressive enough last time. Here we go. And that bat is going to drive me bananas. You guys see it? You can hear it probably too. It's like clickety, clickety, click. So that's causing a problem, right? It's because the bat is lifting and driving into the bat. So let's see here. Let's just pull this off for a second, and maybe we can jam some clay in there, maybe. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drop some, I know there's special tricks and stuff, but I don't have any of those tricks with me, right? There's special little things you can do to make it happen, but there's like a pad you can put on, there's things that dampen it, there's all sorts of little things. But I don't have those set up, so we're just going to keep going. How do we overcome this situation? I don't know. Here we go. All right, so hopefully that works. So you'll see here now, it's kind of a little bit hourglassy, right? You see how it's thinner here in the middle? It's narrower here, so I need to fix that because that makes this top part weak because it's flaring outward. All right, so here. So I couldn't be as aggressive as I wanted to because that bat was like lifting. We'll see if that other thing fixes. We'll see if that other thing fixes it. So that was my second raise. I might be able to get 4 raises out of this because I'm not being as aggressive as I normally would. It's hard to get this whole surface wet, so we'll squirt this on like that. We'll squirt this on like that. Always fix your cylinder in between raises. Always fix them. It needs to be as straight or tapering inward as possible, but still straight walled. All right, here we go. Now, as I raise this cylinder will get pretty tall. And that if you look at me here, right, as the cylinder gets tall, I get weak as the cylinder gets tall. Like this is everybody hold your hands up in front of you. This is a very weak position. So what I'm going to do for this last raise is I'm going to stand up and lean myself against the wheel so that or I could get a taller, let's just use a taller stool, right? I'm going to raise the stool all the way up, right? So now I'm much more over the cylinder. I'll do the raise, right? And then that means I'm not in a weak position when I get to the height that I want it to be. My hope is that this is my last raise, right? Everything's wet. I will probably use my fingers, right? And I'm already thinking about how I need to do it, right? So I probably can't connect my hands because you see that one hand is way in there, right? So I can't hold them together like I usually do. So they have to work separate. I'm going to use my fingertips instead of this knuckle thing, my finger knuckle, right? And so they have to work separate. And then as I go up, I'll connect them together. The minute I can reach them over and connect them, you'll see me connect them like that as I go up. Okay? All right, here we go. Any questions? All right, here we go. I'm just making sure the whole thing's nice and wet because I don't like stopping in between. Maybe I'm not going to connect my hands together. All right, so I'm slowing down the wheel speed because I'm getting that turn, that twist in it. That's no fun. Disheartening. All right, so I had because you see that twist started happening there, I had to slow down my wheel a little bit, let up the pressure. Right, because I didn't want that to influence it. So right around here, I started taking it easy on the pressure. I'm probably going to have to come back and redo that, and then I let it flare out some. Right, so let's see how let's get this camera in a better spot now because it's so big. And then, all right, so now we have this funky looking shape. The first thing I need to do is fix this hourglass shape. I'm just gonna come up here and squish that together. Right, that's pretty easy. Whew. All right, so now I'm gonna come back here and just push this out a little bit. You see how this like dives in pretty fast? That's from me pushing. I'll just push that out. So I'm doing some correction on the cylinder, right, to make it better, right, as far as the wobbliness. Right, and I'm thinking, do I think I can do one more raise? Let's just leave it. All right, so it's a class 1. So it is, let's check thickness, right? I think I'm gonna be okay with this thickness. So let's look at the thickness, right? And you can see there's tons of water down there. We're gonna get that out in a second. So we can easily see this thickness here, right? We can stab the needle tool through and push it back to the surface and we can check. So it is that thick, right? There, right? I can then go down a couple of inches and do the same thing. Push it all the way through to see the needle tool. I'll push it back and then look, I can compare that, how thick it is. I can go like to the halfway point, stab, pull it back and check again. Oh, this cylinder is pretty even. Evenness is better than tallness at this stage because you can always learn how, that's a good habit. Right? And you can always learn how to make your cylinder thinner, but if your clay is much thicker down below, you're not using your clay efficiently. So learning how to use your clay efficiently is much more. So if you look, even down there, I checked way down here at the bottom, it's about the same thickness. So I'm actually in good shape. We're just gonna run with this. All right, so first thing to do is now that I've decided that's it for raising, I'm gonna take my sponge and mop out the inside. And then
raise, it's gonna ruin it.
Maybe. I might be able to get away with it, but we're just gonna go with it. Because a thicker cylinder is more safer for me when the less chance of it falling apart. Right? And
when I push in, I get pushing too hard that I feel that I've made it thinner than the rest of it.
we'll talk about how to push it in here in a second. All right. So the first thing I want to do is with all this clay slop on the outside, we are going to get rid of that by taking 2 ribs and scraping inside and outside like this, right? And just scrape off all the clay, all the goopiness like that. Because all that goopy clay on the outside and inside is just creating, it's just making the cylinder wetter and weaker. I'm gonna go with a harder rib on the inside. One thing you'll notice that when I'm doing this, right, this side of the rib is flat right here. And that what I'm doing though is I'm not pushing it flat. What I'm doing is I'm turning it a little bit like that. You guys see that? So from the straight up and down, I turn it. So basically this part, only the center section is touching the cylinder. Can you guys see that? I rotate it, not that flat, but a little bit like that. So even though I'm using the flat side, the cylinder isn't necessarily completely flat. So if I use the flat, completely flat and vertical, it will gouge out different parts. But if I turn it a little bit, right, it will only touch the middle, which does a really good job. Inside, I'm using the rounded side. So go up slowly. This is my second time, right? I was doing this from the outside and inside. So not as much clay will go, whoa! It will almost, I almost caught the rib. All right, so we're looking pretty good. Now I have to start thinking, it feels pretty good. So we're ready to go for make the next thing. So when I look at the cylinder, I have to think about what I want to make, right? So we want to make a bottle. So we have to leave some clay at the top to make the neck, right, and the thing. So I'm going to leave some clay behind for that. And then I'm just going to have a form here. If I want it like a football shape or a barrel shape, I have to ignore this part of the clay. And then that means the widest point could be here. That makes sense? So I have to plan out how I'm going to use the clay. So here we go. Let's start doing it. So I'm going to push this out. I'm going to ignore this part and just start pushing out down here. There we go. Oop. Go all the way down to the bottom, and I'll do it again. I'm being pretty aggressive. You don't have to be this aggressive. This is called stretching. That's a technique that I use where I don't touch the outside and I already scraped off the water. So it allows the clay to kind of inflate. You'll notice I start at the top of my form and work my way down. I'm ignoring the part that's going to be the neck, right? So here I push it out. And then what I kind of want it to become is a skinnier version of what I want it to be later. That makes sense? So you see how it's starting to look kind of vasey right now. It's starting to take on that barrel shape that I was talking about. So I'll push out a little bit more here. I feel like I can take a bigger bite off of there. Like I got plenty of clay to make the bottle part. So I move that up. So you see how each time it just gets a little bit wider, right? And then there are lots of ways to do this. So if you watch other people doing it, they throw it, they use two ribs, they throw it, or they'll throw the form with their fingers, right? So those are all good techniques. It's just not how I learned how to do it. So here, right, I have to really start making choices now. I want it fatter, bigger, wider, right? So I'm going to push out a little bit more. But with this technique, I can kind of stop anytime. Right? Does that make sense? It just keeps getting closer and closer to what I want. Sometimes I'm not sure exactly what I want, right? Because sometimes it gets to something and I think, oh, that's not what I was thinking, but that looks pretty good, and I'll stop there. Right. Now, would I stop here normally? Like, I don't know, but I'm going to stop here. Right? It's good enough. So this part is basically done down on the body. Now I have to figure out what I'm going to do here. You see I left plenty of clay because this has to travel. If it's going to be a bottle, it's kind of a vase. If it's going to be a bottle, it has plenty of clay to go in. But let's make it to a vase first, because vases are easier, and then we'll make it into a bottle. Now I have to worry about this curve going inward, right? This shoulder gets close, right? But now I have to use this guy, and I could fold this guy. I could use this rib here and just push in. So it's like doing a giant cup or something, right? We've done this before. Right? And what's important to me, and you have to decide what's important to you, is how this curve transitions from here into here and back in. So let's just make it kind of a smooth kind of curve, I guess. Now, as I do this, it may look different, right? I may decide, oh, I want this more pushed out, for example, in here. Then I can still reach in here and do some pushing outward, right, to fix that up. All right, so you see that's a vase. Now, one of my teacher who taught me how to throw bigger forms, taller forms, said that if he gives this to his wife and it has a big wide opening like this, he has to buy her lots of flowers. Right? And if the smaller he makes his opening, like if he makes it really small, he only has to buy her one rose. Still has to make the vase for her, right? So, but it looks gorgeous with that one rose. So he would make these much smaller than this. So let's make it smaller, right? To make it your life easier. So now I have to wet it down because I have to try to compress this. This has to travel a long ways. So I'm going to now add water. So this is the first time I'm adding water. I do want to check the inside before I close this up. Make sure the inside is dry and clean and nice. Because once I close this up, the inside bottom, I'm not getting back in there again, right? This is like I can still fit my hand inside. So here I'm going to wet this down, right? And then, so what am I going to do? So I'm not trying to wet this part down here, right? I'm just trying to wet the part I have to narrow up, right? So I just wet that part down. It's okay if some water drips down. Now then what I want to do is take my fingers, and everybody do this with their fingers, is to kind of make two L's. One's a backwards L, one's a forward L, and then just bend your index fingers in, kind of like you're making like an OK symbol, but you're leaving your like that. Does that make sense? Like that. And then I'm going to push against this neck here of my cylinder, right, with 6 points. 1, 2, 3. Pushing with my finger, pushing kind of with the knuckle back of my finger here, and pushing with my thumb like that. And this helps coax the clay inward. You see how I re-wet the area? Because this has to be slick. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to push in like this. And you can kind of speed up the wheel, and you see how it just shrank in. Right? And you could do this a couple of times, but after a while, the clay starts cooperating because the clay is compressing in and getting thicker, and starts to fight back. So next thing you have to do is do like a little miniature throwing raise. The part that I want to do mainly is right here. I don't want to reach down into the shoulder part because I need some strength there, because that shoulder needs some strength to be able to go inward. And what's going to happen if I weaken this or make this too thin is it's want to collapse, right? It needs to support that. But I do need to thin this out so I can come back and do this move again to tighten her up. Because I just can't keep doing this over and over. The clay just starts fighting back so much. All right, so I talked too long, so I have to wet it down. So critical that...
It's under.
I lost my sponge. I need a sponge. Oh, okay. I thought you meant on the floor. All right. So here we get to go again. I have to wet it down because friction is your enemy. You'll notice that I'm using, when I throw this, I'm using my fingertips, like one pinky, because I'm limiting my contact space too. I'm not using knuckle, would be exactly the wrong thing to do. We need finesse and speed, right? Remember we talked about bigger piece of clay, slower. This is a small piece of clay, and as I get smaller even, I will use less. So you see I'm pushing here. I'm not really doing much from the inside, right? I just have my finger there. And you can see how it just choked in like that. Ooh, you can see how that totally changed it, right? We'll do it one more time. And here I'm going to be right about here on the inside, and you'll see where my hand is on the outside. You see how I sped up the wheel a bunch? Ooh, you see that? Now I have to start making decisions, meaning that the neck is getting longer. Right, that's good. I was counting on that because as it gets narrower, the clay gets thicker, and then I have to throw it to raise it up. Now the thing is, you just always got to leave enough clay. Like, it always looks weird when you don't leave enough clay in the vertical section of your cylinder. It's better to have a little bit too much that you can cut off. And now I can go back to the squeezy mode where I just go from the outside. So I wet my sponge here, and I'll just wet it down. And guess what I'm about to do? I'm about to do this again and push in from the outside. Now, I'm not going to push too much here. I'm going to mainly push in this vertical section. Oh, and I have to think about what it's going to be, right? I could leave it like this, right? I could just flare this guy out, right? Because you can see it's something, right? So you get lots of choice here. There's an infinite number of different things you can do, right? You can leave this a little wider. You can have this flip out. This is a thing, right? Where the cylinder is just cylindrical. That's a thing. That's something. You see how that's completely different than this, right? It changes the entire feeling. And the other thing that is, you can see those, I forgot where they're from, but they have those ones that taper inward like this, right? And those are like a bottle, and they put a cork in, right? And you see how that constricted feeling up here changes how the form feels, right? How this line, there's an imaginary force or line that we use in our brain. This is coming together up in space, like up in here, right? There's a point where these walls would meet. We feel that psychologically, right? Does that make sense? And it changes that, where this, when we fold this out, there's another that changes that completely, and there's a line that scoops in and then scoops out in the space, right? How that pot feels and the energy, or however you want to say it, right? It changes how it feels. Let's do something else since I banged it. Let's just do it, right? I could do something like that, right? And I'm only doing this now because I can still make drastic changes to it, right? And that changes how we feel about the pot. So we can always cut stuff off when we don't like it, because I don't want to show you that. We want to make it into a bottle, right? Because you can see how I can stop anytime. Let's make it into a bottle. What step was I on? I was in the constrict. I was ready to do constriction phase, like not the throwing part. So here I wet it down, right? And then I have to start making choices here. So I'm going to do that move again, and it's really wet and slickery. And you see how fast my wheel is going? It just likes to go fast for this. So one more time. All right, so now it's getting to the point where I can't really get my whole hand in there. I can only get like one finger in there, and I have to start watching my proportions, right? This bottle has a certain mass and a certain height. How does this relationship figure out with that? There's an infinite number of good and then bad answers, right? Does that make sense? I can't decide that for you, right? So I'll just go and then I'll do this one more raise. I have to wet the inside a little bit. This is difficult. Maybe I'll just use my finger here and just wet the inside, because this has to be slick. The slickness is important right there on the inside. And I don't want to dump water in there, right? If I dump water, a bunch of water to try to wet that, then there's going to be a bunch of water trapped at the bottom. So here we're just going to go super fast. We're getting close to done. So this is the only time I throw with the wheel this fast, right? And you see that I'm barely touching the thing. Let's go to the overhead view. I was barely touching it, right? Just with my fingertips. I think I can do one more, so I have to wet it down, and then I'll do constrictions from the outside. Oh. All right, so we're getting close, and then you see that I'm leaving this flared out because I like a little bit of flare out at the top. All right, I think that's it for this one. At some point, is this still a vase? Is it a bottle? What is it? It's both, right? At some point, it transforms from vase into bottle, right? But it's partially the shape, right? Because a bottle kind of implies like you can cork it or something, right? So if I change this shape up here, it would most definitely be a different something. That makes sense. But it's kind of like, in general, rule of thumb, and it's not a real rule of thumb, is my teacher said if it's less than a third the width of the widest point. I don't know if I 100% agree with that, but that's just the way. It's just easy to say. It's an easy idea to hold in yourself. But you know when it's a vase or a bottle, right? That makes sense? In your heart. No, and then, you know. So you see I'm straightening out this bottle form. I'm making this straighter. I wasn't telling you what I was doing, but I'm pressing this in to try to make this more straight. It's very strange. This is moving around on its own. Or flipping down when I'm not looking. Oh, it's because the screw is a little loose. Something's loose. Oh, sorry. Give me a minute to self-correct. All right, so now I'm trying to think. This looks okay. So now there's this part here. This just doesn't look great. There's some waveriness here. So I can take this and kind of fix this up a little by pushing down. And if I have a little bit of strength here, I can use that rib to kind of help shape it a little bit. Now, probably would have been better if I did this a little bit earlier, right? Because I can't get back in there. But one thing I could have done a little bit earlier was, and I didn't get this out because I wanted to show you, is maybe I could still use one of these, are these throwing sticks. And that's what these are for. If you've ever wondered, these are for trying to get back in there and pushing it out. I don't think I can get this one in anymore. I think I went too far. So maybe it's worthwhile to try to widen it so I can try to get it back in. Right, and then because what happens here, if you look closely, there's a spot here that's too low. You see that? It's and it dips down a little bit. Is that going to drive me nuts? Maybe. And so I'll try to get this guy back in without ruining it. So you see that how I was able to sneak it in. And then I'm going to try to push this little knob underneath there, right? Just like as if we were ribbing it from before, right? We use the rib to push it out. I'm going to try to sneak this guy in there and push that part out. And why? It's because it's really important to me that it looks good. And so I think I got it right about there. And I'll push back out. And I think I got it. Now, I could try to smooth it out, but I think I'm at the point where I don't have to smooth it out now. I can wait till it's leather hard, right? Does that make sense? So you see how that? Now, it could be that you want a more positive curve. Now that you see everything happening, you want a more inflated form. This is the time to do it. Let's just do it. John Hasegawa opened up his big mouth, so he's going to do it. So you can see where I'm pushing, right? And down there, and I'll do it again. I'm right here. Push, 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 push. This is perfectly fine to do. This isn't cheating. This is just the way it goes. That makes sense? So you see how that's just more positive and more like, right? It's just more inflated looking, and you see it barely made a difference. Right? Like to anyone else in the world, they'll be like, if you weren't into this, they don't care. But why is that important? Because it was important to me, right? I do care that you see it or not, but you have to decide what's important to you, right? And for me, that was really important. So I would go back and alter this, because I could have ruined my neck by widening and stuffing this back down in there and pushing it out. You have to decide, is that important to you? And so that makes it me and less of someone else, like you, because other people may have not done that. All right, so now I can go back and fix this because I damaged this a little bit, right? And I hope I can fix it, right? So now I have to make a choice. Oh, this looks kind of good, right? You see how this comes up, looks good, looks good, looks good. And it has like a little bit of an hourglass shape here. Maybe that's what I want. So let's play with this hourglass shape a little bit. And let's do one thing about this. So let's do this. Let's do an hourglass shape where the constricted part is in the middle. And then we'll do an hourglass shape where the constricted part is a little lower than there. And you'll see a difference there. So here I can just use this rib here. I have to be careful because this is really weak. I have to push this in like that, right? And you can see that's an hourglass shape. I'm trying to put, and you can just see that that looks pretty good now, right? I love that shape, right? It's a very classic. I'll fix some of this bumpiness here later, right? Now we could consider that done, right? Or let's do one where we move the waist a little lower, and you'll see the language and everything kind of changes about it. So I can't necessarily use the rib for that because that's too much pressure all over the place. I need to go back to my fingertips and make sure it's all wet and slimy. And I'm going to push this part in, and then you'll see I'm not necessarily going to make this narrower. I'm going to make this part narrower, and I'll move the constricted part to lower. So you see how that looks different, right? And that when I'm going to make this part right about here the narrowest part. And you can see how much difference that makes, right? It doesn't feel like the same pot anymore, right? It's something different, right? And it's just the way it feels, right? So for me, I am not necessarily satisfied with the pot sometimes it's giving me. I like playing around with it. And then you could look at like, what's the difference between like a Greek vase or a Roman vase or a Persian one, right? Or something more from Egypt, right? Because they all have beautiful pottery. And then right, the Greeks and the Romans were all over the place. They influence everything, but there's different, or an Asian vase, right? Or Asian pot, right? They do different things. They put different constriction points, have the curve transform in slightly different ways, right? And then let's figure out the top. The rim is always the last thing, right? And I'm not really focused on what's going on here, so we're just going to leave it, and I'll do some more tidying up later. But the last thing is always the top, because this is the weakest and I don't want to mess around with it until the very end, and I'll just do a slice off because I kind of mess that top off. I have to be very careful. You can see it flopping around a little, and then we just do this. I'm going to round it off, and then we'll play around just a little bit with that. Ooh. Right, so I'm just going to round it off, and then this little end makes a big difference. So right now it's just going straight out like I don't know what that would be. It's just kind of mainly straight. But what if I take this and I fold it out a little? And once again, that changes a lot how it feels, right? And so I'm thinking, I don't know what I'm thinking about, but you may have a feeling like you want elegance or trumpet or something like that, right? There's lots of different things you can think about how this shape ends. We're just going to stop there because I think you see all the little changes that make a big difference about how the pot feels, right? So you don't, as a beginner or as someone that hasn't made these that much, you don't know what those choices are. And you don't know how it's going to change, but be really watchful of when you touch the clay and how it looks different from before, right? And then how do you know which things you want? You have to make a bunch, and then you decide later, like, I wish I hadn't done that, or I wish I had done more, right? I stopped too early, right? And because sometimes it comes down to, I don't care if it collapses, I'm playing with it too much, it's not mine yet, or it's not there, right? How do you figure that out? You just got to make a bunch, right? And then that's how you develop the groove of what you find out that's personally awesome to you, right? And so I don't know, how did I figure this out? I don't know, it just happens, right? And you get drawn to it somehow. That makes sense. For me, it's about the making, and then during the making, I see what I want. Right? For me, I can't journal. I mean, I can a little bit, but it's not like a pleasurable experience, and I don't find that I'm working out the ideas very well, right? As I'm journaling or drawing pictures, it doesn't get me closer to what I want. It's like, for me, it's all about the making, and the making, I feel it, and I see it happen, and I think, and I bend the clay, and like, oh, yes. And then later on, I'm like, no, that was the wrong, you know, it's a very troublesome, not very, smooth experience internally, right? But I only know through the making, right? And so by bending it back and forth and being very watchful of how I feel about those moments is very key. That makes sense to everybody? So be very mindful of how and what you're doing from moment to moment. And you see how that transforms right in front of you, right? Any questions? We're going to trim this next time. All right, good.